Welcome to Tavern Talks, guide. Hello. Gather around, travelers. Welcome to Tavern Talks, the video podcast where game masters, gamers, TTRPG content creators from around the world share their secrets, stories, and expertise on crafting the perfect TTRPG experiences and sessions. Okay, so in this cozy virtual tavern, we'll be sitting down with experienced people, with people that knows to swap tales, trade tips, and they dive into the art of creating the unforgettable experiences, let's say. So from world building to NPC crafting, from session prep to improvisation to accessibility and everything, we'll cover it all. So grab a pint of your favorite virtual ale, pull up a chair, and join the conversation. In this episode, we'll be chatting with Bosch, right? And their journey as a, of course, LARP player, content creator. Oh my god. Oh my god. They know where.
We have a lot of projects, I know.
And they're doing everything. So electricity. Let's get talking. So my first question. My first question is, who are they? Who is Bosch?
I am many things. If we want to get, when I'm talking about who I am in terms of tabletop game design, often where I start is that I am a theater kid and a voracious reader, and that grew in a lot of different directions that landed me into tabletop games. I'm also, for a US-based tabletop game designer, I am one of the slightly weird unicorns in that Dungeons and Dragons was not my introduction to game design. I think of my path in game design as starting very much when I was a really little kid who just loved telling stories. I had a tape recorder that my parents got me, and I would just narrate stories into it all the time. I would write little scripts. I would try to make other people in my family perform the scripts I was writing with me. And so when I was 4, my parents put me in a children's community theater program, and I started learning to act and improvise and do that kind of creative collaborative storytelling and getting into character with other people. And I was in children's theater really, really regularly from age 4 to about age 14. Yeah. And during that time, I got deeper into just reading in general. My parents were huge comic collectors during the 1980s. They collected especially a lot of like weird independent press comics. And so when I was 15, they opened up their whole comics library to me. And that was another trove of just like really amazing stories and really interesting and complex perspectives on storytelling and history, because a lot of the things that were published in the 1980s by independent presses were responding to a lot of really intense political events in the US, to the AIDS epidemic, to war, to like really, really dangerous and concerning like government practices and lack of government response.
Yeah, that's right.
Were happening. And so I was running into all these stories that were these interesting combinations of fiction and personal narrative and political commentary, and also were very often responses to really distinct things that I was sort of learning about through the art made about them. Responses to government censorship, responses to the fact that the Catholic Church was stigmatizing like gay people to a really distinctive degree, to the point that new schools of activist thought were springing up out of it. This is just a perpetual indulgence, like drag queen activist collectives who still exist nowadays and do community and charity work around the US and the world. And things, those were all things that I was learning through like, weird independent comics. And so I think those two experiences in particular are things that really shaped my sense of how to tell stories and the number of different ways you can tell a story and why you can be telling a story.
Or you were the star child of the family, and you learned your acting first, and then meet with the comics, and everything changed.
It clicked open a much bigger range of a sense of what can happen in stories, like different forms, different styles. And yeah, I'm an only child. I was a doted upon only child, but I have a big extended family. So if I wanted to make everyone perform in a play, there were a lot of relatives who were sometimes willing to indulge me, and things like that. And I had a lot of cousins where we would do really in-depth, like, we'd have years-long campaigns, like stories that we were running that were just loose imagination.
Slowly.
So all of those things I feel like really kind of primed me. So when I discovered what tabletop games were. I discovered them out of my love of comics. I went from reading my parents' old print comics into discovering web comics and reading a bunch of what was being put out online. And then there was one time where a couple of webcomic artists whose work I liked were posting about how they were going to be on a podcast. And I went, oh, I love these people's art. I'm going to go listen to them on a podcast. They were on the One Shot podcast, which specifically features lots of different tabletop RPGs that are designed to be played in a single session. So once you start listening to a show like that, you're getting a whole bunch of examples of extremely different ways that tabletop games can look. And so because I was a fan of these comic artists and I listened to them on a podcast, suddenly I was just deluged by this amazing archive of really easy to listen to, like 1 to 4 episode long actual plays of a whole bunch of different tabletop games. And so once that happened, that was electric. There was this whole creative dimension that I hadn't known about before. And that was when I was in my late teens. And so while I was in college, I got really, really deep into learning on that front. And I think the first tabletop game creator I really fell in love with the work of was Avery Alder. Also the first openly trans people I saw doing tabletop game work. Certainly not the only person, but a really cool and notable force in the field, writer of Monster Hearts. And so there were a lot of elements there where I think that gave me, again, a really creative, expansive sense of what games and what you were allowed to do. And so from then, I knew I wanted to play more tabletop games. I knew they were fun. I didn't really know a lot about how to play them outside of just my own interpretive guesses, which work a lot of the time. But I knew there was more to learn. I wanted to connect more with people who already knew about this stuff. That really clicked in when I moved to Washington State. I'm from California. I moved to Washington to do a graduate program in education, and I never left because I really like it. And there's a lot of other Californians here. It's the same time zone, but it's a little less on fire than our home state. But what happened there was my graduate program was on an island on the coast. I was living in the woods, learning about outdoor environmental education with a bunch of other graduate students. We were running outdoor field trips in the woods. So it was really cool, but really hard to go do any other activities because living in a bunch of little cabins in the woods on an island with not very transit. If you want to get into the city, you have to get on a boat. But I really wanted to be more social and meet more people. So I went to Emerald City Comic Con. I took a bus and then a ferry and then another bus to go to this comic convention. And there were different one-shot tabletop game sessions you could sign up for. There were people who were facilitating games. And so I played Ben Robbins's game, Follow, in a single session there. And it was a very chaotic playthrough. It was me and a bunch of teenage boys who were all friends and the game facilitator. The only player who was not part of an existing friend group of teenage boys. So I wouldn't say the group communication was the best or the smoothest, but the game facilitator was lovely and the game was interesting. And so the person who had been facilitating the game told me, hey, there's this monthly meetup where people play one-shot tabletop games at this comic and game store in Seattle. You should come to it. I think you'd have a good time. And so I developed this routine where, a few times a month, depending on when things were scheduled to happen, I would take a bus and then a ferry and then another bus.
Weird commitment
into Seattle, and I would play tabletop games with people for several hours. And then at the time I was dating someone who worked really late. So when they got off their late shift, would pick me up from my late game and we'd go fall asleep. And then hang out in the morning. And then I'd take a bus and then a ferry and then another bus and go back to my graduate school program. So tabletop games really kind of saved me socio-emotionally when I was feeling really isolated, when I was doing a thing really good for me academically, but I was feeling like I really deeply needed to have connections that were not my school. Even if all of your classes are lovely, if you're living and working and taking all your classes with the same 14 people, you can want a little variety. And so tabletop games, they let me meet new people and they also let me be new people. They let me explore creative energy in ways that were really, really lovely and satisfying for me. And that just kind of kept cascading. Once I made friends in that scene, I started making friends with people who were writing their own games. We're talking about game design challenges. One of the first games I wrote was for the 200-word RPG challenge. I was one of the people who submitted something to the Emotional Mech Jam back when that was run on itch.io. And I think, one of the first times that the game jam feature on itch.io got used to host a tabletop game design jam rather than a computer game design jam. And once that idea was out there in the ether, then the huge cascade of game jams happened. And that worked great for me because it gave me deadlines. And it gives you a built-in sense of community where, other people are brainstorming and working around similar kinds of ideas. And you have people who are built in who you can talk to about it because you're all curious about the same kind of thing. You're trying to do something creative off of the same prompt, even if you end up making something very different. And honestly, it's really, really cool to see how many different things you can make out of the same premise. So that once that happened, then I was really hooked. I was like, this is part of my life now, both because I'm having fun with it and also because now this is one of the ways that I connect with a whole bunch of my friends. By learning how to facilitate these games, how to run these games, and how to design these games, how to tell these different kinds of stories. And then kind of the most recent dimension that got built onto that was when the COVID-19 pandemic first hit. Starting to experiment with all the different ways you can be social online. Way more people got on Discord or different online platforms who weren't there already. So there was this influx of new energy and people looking for things to do. And in a weird way, even though LARPing, like live action role playing, is so much more closely connected to doing things physically in person, in the early days of the pandemic, people were experimenting a lot more all over the place with what can live action role playing look like online? Are there ways to do that online that still feel interesting and immersive, even though you can't be, interacting in character in person? And so I got way more into LARP because suddenly it was way more accessible to get connected to LARPers. I didn't have to physically go somewhere to meet people. I could connect with people who were really big in LARP in entirely different regions from me. And I also, at a convention I'd gone to before the pandemic hit, I'd gotten on the mailing list for a Seattle-based, small-scale local company that writes and designs and facilitates murder mystery games, which are kind of the old genre.
I do love those modern murder mystery games. They're easy to find, but still perfect.
And so they started playtesting. They're like, hey, we need playtesters to help us figure out how to run our games online. And we're designing more games that are designed to run online.
Oh.
And for a while, I got to be a playtester for murder mystery LARPs. They were testing all kinds of things. They're like, can this virtual conference software work well for this? Like, what platforms, formats? How do we explore this? People were using Gather.town. People were using softwares I'd never heard of. There was one game that I played in that was very funny. It was using a virtual conference software. It's set up like a digital layout as though there's a bunch of little tables you could go and sit at. And so on a table, then you're sitting there virtually. And so your audio and video feed become available to everyone else at the table, but not to everyone else outside of that area. So
makes sense.
A little cluster, or you could get up and move tables. So you could have different discussion groups. You could wander, but there were limited seats at every table. I think there were 5 to 8 or something like that. A limited but clear number. Someone else in that game was trying to kill my character and failed at it because I kept sitting down at tables where I was filling the last remaining spot. And so they could not physically join the table to attack me in game. This was not intentional on my part. I had no idea someone was hunting me down. Talked about it in the debrief. And so that ended up being kind of a fascinating case of, when you experiment with these different digital programs for trying to interact like that, what happens? Because in person, there wouldn't be an automatic limit. Someone could have come up and tapped me on the shoulder and said, hey, my character is about to attack you, even if the table was out of chairs. But in a virtual space where the coding of it was locked to only allow, 5 people, 8 people, whatever it was per table, I accidentally made myself unattackable by the tables I sat at. So, that added a whole other layer to the kinds of ideas and things I was curious about. And it also made me new friends in new parts of the scene. That's how I learned more about people doing interactive edge LARPing, writing LARP specifically for educational purposes about topics like sexual health and relationship communication. I met those people and made those connections because of the COVID-19 pandemic. So really, really awful, tragic, stressful world events, but I love the connectivity that we're able to find in those rough moments.
I was able to play almost 10 hours a day or 6 hours a day thanks to the pandemic. And I was it was my peak era in terms of playing and creating stuff. And right now it's just I'm just trying to find time. But it wasn't like that at the COVID. So it was like a bliss and a kind of course, also a curse at the same time.
The shape of time became very different for everyone. In different people who were suddenly oh, I don't have to go anywhere. The shape of my day has changed from that. And then there were the other people who still had to physically go to locations and work, who were dealing with all these almost dream walking people whose schedules had been turned upside down, but still needed to go get groceries. And yeah, I was connecting with people in a lot of different facets of that because I was working in childcare. Um, so that was there was a big period of time where my work was remote, but really weird because you can't do direct child supervision virtually. My job kept changing formats and became a lot more tech support. And then when things started going back in person, there were arcs of time where I was one of the main people doing things in person when a lot of other people weren't. Um, so I feel like it's been a lot of different ebbs and flows. And yeah, how do we connect with ourselves creatively when there's big stressors and tragedies and structural change going on? Because it really affects so many things. But I'm grateful for the friends and connections I've got to make through that because it definitely deepened my connection to TTRPG and LARP. It also deepened my connection to zine making and zines. A lot of LARP friends I made in part because I helped run an online queer zine festival. We started it early in the pandemic. It's still running. I think the current one just finished or is wrapping up currently. I wasn't involved in the organizing committee this year, but I'm still connected to the people who do. And so that's been going strong as an entirely virtual zine festival. And so a way for people to connect about their art online in a bunch of different ways. And learn about new artists. And connected to that too, the printing studio where I go to do my risograph printing, which I love is just like a weird specific old type of printer that makes really vivid layered colors with soy-based inks. Mostly just used by artists now, though it was envisioned as being a much more general use printer to a degree, I think. They marketed a lot to like churches and community organizations, like print all your flyers. And then the artist got a hold of it and went, we're going to do weird color layering offset things with this. Give us all your most fluorescent pink ink. But during the pandemic, the local print studio that I go to do my printing, they have a great program where you can learn how to use their printers and go in and just use them yourself in person. They'll like train you on it. And then so you can print for cheap because they want more people to learn how to use the technology. They started running a Zine of the Month club, which I think they also might still have as a degree of ongoing thing, where they would teach you how to do the digital formatting for a 2-color risograph zine. And if you set them the appropriate formatted files by the monthly deadline and also paid them the print costs for being part of the club, they would print you 30 copies of your one-page zine.
30 copies.
Each of everyone else's zine that they made for that month. And you would get sent this big flat envelope of these unfolded single sheet zines, and you had to take them out and assemble them and fold them up and explore them. So you would just get a random sampling of what a bunch of other people wanted to print that. So I got everything from poetry to games to informational guides, to political flyers to notices about the local bicycle club. So that was another really amazing, weird little window into like what people were doing artistically in a really strange moment. So that's a very long answer to who I am. I'm very chatty, and I am also creative to a fault. I don't know how to not be doing creative things. When I'm not doing creative things, it stresses me out and makes me feel less like myself. And so that's taken a lot of manifestations over the years. I've written poetry, I've written scripts, I've written prose, I've written music, I've performed in a band, I've done a lot of theater. But especially I've drawn comics, but especially at this phase that I'm in my life, for like the past, oh God, time is weird. For the past 8 years or so, some of my deepest involvements have been in zine making and game design.
So actually, you answered some of my questions. So
that commonly happens when people interview me.
That was great. So no problem with that. Actually, I was pretty happy. So let me just check my questions quickly because oh my God, you answered all.
The jabber about, never fear.
I really do want to ask you actually before going on to like what do you do when or how you about your TTRPGs or LARP sessions. I just want to ask about like, do you have a favorite TTRPG system and or favorite fantasy book or yeah?
Good questions. Okay. Favorite fantasy books. It's so hard to pick one thing, but in terms of the books that I go back to again and again, the books from like I don't feel like I'm ever gonna get tired of rereading this. I love Ursula K. Le Guin. I love all her stuff. The Hainish Cycle, her classic, more famous sci-fi books. I love one of my very favorite of her books. I like in part because it's set sort of where I grew up, but it's set thousands of years in the future after our societies have all crumbled. It's like an imagined future. She has a book called Always Coming Home that's imagining a sort of anthropological exploration of a future society that might exist long after all of our current societies have, vanished in nuclear apocalypse or otherwise. And it's very tender and strange and lovely. And it especially as someone who's been trained in environmental education, it made me think a lot about sort of how our environmental life philosophies shape how we view the world and how we interact with other people and other living things. There's a passage in Always Coming Home where she talks about how in the language and the culture and the context of this imagined world, like a botanist studying like a blight that's affecting pear trees, says that he studied with the pear trees of a certain area. Not that he studied the pear trees, he studied with them. The pear trees were doing the research with him. They were also agents in that process about the things that were affecting them. And that's certainly, that's not like a special fantasy thing Ursula Le Guin made up. Many languages and cultural contexts acknowledge like, the spirit and the energy and the agency of other living things that aren't human. But the way that she intentionally structures and articulates that is very engaging and satisfying. The ways she imagines like how culture and life could ripple out. And the different just ways her world building is so tasty. She's a child of anthropologists, and that shows through in her world building. There's a richness to how she thinks about the structural implications of the world she rules. And I find that very inspiring.
Or and stuff you can clearly see that there's a different special thing in it. For example, like the whole thing going on with the equilibrium thing that going on, like that's amazing virtual. That's not a nice big set. What about your TTRPG favorite one?
Oh, favorite TTRPGs. Again, God, it's so hard to choose. But if I want to go with a game that just my game writing would not be what it was without it, I might have to go with Downfall by Carolyn Hobbs. It is one of my favorite games. And two big things. I wrote about it in one of my culminating essays for my graduate work. I wrote about game design, like GM-less or GM-ful, like games that do not have a single facilitator, and the ways some of those design philosophies and qualities, the ways you can bring them into a classroom. And think about how do you talk about power and control in classrooms, because you can't make there stop being a teacher if you're existing within a school system that requires there to be a teacher. But you can talk to kids about those systems and structures of authority, and you can help give them formats and ideas of how to learn and engage with you and each other in different ways. And I think a lot of GM-less tabletop games give you formats for talking about and saying, here are the ways we're going to share our ideas or share power or authority in a situation in an intentional way that we're talking about. Because if you just say to kids, oh, no one's in charge here, we're all teachers, we're all learners, that doesn't actually do a lot. Kids know you're still more in charge than they are, and that other adults treat you as more in charge than they are, that you have the power to grade them and to affect their behavior and how they're allowed to move or be in a classroom. But Carolyn Hobbs is writing for Downfall. Downfall is a game that does a thing. Avery Alder, whose work I also really love, describes this as character non-monogamy, where you design characters either on your own or with your fellow players, and then more than one person plays that character. You are rotating who is responsible for a character or characters at different points in time in the game. Downfall is a game where you build a society that has a fatal flaw in it, and then you go through these scenes where you figure out how the society is going to fall apart. So the game may end up tragic or hopeful for the characters on various levels, but the society is going to crumble. It's called Downfall. There's a built-in tragic event that is going to happen. And that's one thing I love. I love games where part of success in playing the game is people say, hey, how was your game last night? And you're like, we destroyed a city. Crumbled. It was in shambles. People scattered to the four winds. And they're like, did you win? And you're like, oh, great story. So of course we won. We had such an interesting time describing how it happened. It helps figure out the different ways that it means to win or to engage with a game through your creative work. But the character non-monogamy is also amazing. You design 3 characters as a group: the hero, the pillar, and the fallen. The hero is trying to save society from this fatal flaw. They believe change is possible. They're going to fail, and society is going to fall anyway. But oh my God, this character is going to try. The flaw is fine. Or they know it's bad, but they don't care because they think there's something in it for them. They are the forces that are helping this flaw take hold and crumble structures down. The pillar is the status quo. The pillar doesn't really think anything's wrong. They haven't noticed how bad things are. They are just believe things are going to be able to keep going on just as they are now. Can't be as bad as people say. And in the course of playing Downfall, you will play all of those characters. If you are in a scene where your assigned character is not there, the hero will always be there, but the pillar might not be in every single scene as a character. If the pillar's not in the scene, but it's your turn to be the pillar, you're going to represent the forces of the status quo in the world. You will help set the tone and remind the other players all the ways that there are some people who think that nothing's on fire and it's all going to be fine. By the same token, if the Fallen's not in the scene, then your job representing the Fallen is to note all the little ways that danger and instability are creeping in and this society is being shaken. And that perspective on design, like designing towards a dramatic, tragic moment of narrative, and also designing a character who you don't have full ownership over, who you're going to hand off to other people to explore in different ways. If I had not read and played that game, the way I design would be wildly different. And in particular, This Party Sucks, my biggest game project, would absolutely not exist without Downfall. From Downfall really directly, and I make no secret of that. Because you can't copyright game mechanics, and I think that's good, but it's still good to give credit in text and in how you talk about your work.
We definitely encourage people to steal some of the mechanics in order to learn it, and also steal them to let the people know there are other games as well that use the same mechanics. So no problem with that, absolutely.
It's gonna look and feel, because again, and a lot of what I like in games too, I love, a system that's really adaptable that you can do a lot of stuff with is really cool. I also love a weirdly specific game.
Yeah, definitely. For example, one-page games and stuff like that, definitely.
Yeah, I played a game once where we were all transgender magic users who were out just pull a powerful magical artifact from a character who was a very thinly veiled version of J.K. Rowling. And that's the whole premise of the game.
Oh my god.
Yeah. I played that one on a podcast, actually. I don't think the podcast is running currently, but for quite a while, I was a repeated guest on the Gaming for Trans Rights Tabletop podcast. They specifically played a bunch of games that were featured in one of the fundraiser game bundles on itch.io. They're in various charity game bundles, for Black Lives Matter, for trans causes, for a bunch of different community causes. And so they were highlighting games by LGBTQ creators that were in that bundle. And I need to go double check the name, but definitely if you look up the Gaming for Trans Rights Tabletop podcast, I think GTRTP cast as its abbreviation, their backlog of stuff, I had a blast being on that show while it was running. And now I want to go check the name of that game too. If I can't find it now, I'll go find it and send it to you later, because
there's going to put in a comment section. I'm going to put that there so viewers can watch and listen there. So, okay, so what were some of the biggest challenges when you're creating your TTRPG, especially? And also, another question, what were some of the biggest challenges again, but of course, being a part of this community?
Yeah, so challenges in game design. I mean, I feel like a lot of the things that are cool about game design are also what make it hard. It's like, there's no singular rule. Games can look all kinds of ways, You have dice, your game doesn't have to require people to inhabit a specific character. It's like, okay, but if anything's possible, that's scary.
Yeah, definitely.
If you have too much creative space, you're going to too much creative material and you're going to trip over it. Which is part of why I like game jams and things like that. So I feel like often my struggle is I'll have an idea, but figuring out what specific mechanics or structures I want to put to that idea, often there's so many ways that you could do a thing that it's tricky to choose. So I enjoy game jams, and those are often my formats for getting around a lot of creative challenges because they narrow down some of the premises. If I know some key themes or ideas that I'm definitely going to incorporate, it starts to become a little easier to figure out what other details I want to piece together. Another thing that's definitely often a challenge is playtesting, especially if you're writing a very weird or specific game. You need to find people who are interested in playtesting. Also, you need to know people. Like, people don't have a built-in automatic community. And even if you have friends who like playing tabletop games, that's not the same as meaning they'll like all the same games as you, because there's so many different kinds of games. Or they might not want to play something that's not really done yet. Playing something in progress and giving feedback is a different experience, and giving thoughtful criticism of a game in process is a distinct skill, and not everyone who likes playing tabletop games likes doing that or wants to learn how to do that.
Mhm.
Finding game design friends whose interests mesh with yours in a useful way, or finding formats and communities where you can bring stuff to playtest. Honestly, that is its own interesting challenge. And the COVID-19 pandemic added to that in a bunch of ways because I used to playtest things at conventions. I'm wearing a shirt from OrcaCon 2017, which is a really lovely, like, Greater Seattle area convention that's entirely focused on tabletop. So, like, board games, card games, TTRPGs. And OrcaCon and I'm blanking on convention names. It'll come back to me in a minute, or it won't. But yeah, there were multiple Seattle area game conventions where I play tested This Party Sucks, and so it very much not be what it was without just tabletop nerds in the Pacific Northwest. Fabric of the game. They helped me structure some specific case. Go Play Northwest. That's the other convention where I play tested. And those are both very tabletop game specific conventions. So if you go to something like that, you're very proud to be able to go, got a new shiny thing. It's not quite finished yet. Do you want to look at it? Be excited. But finding those spaces is its own challenge. And yeah, are you going to find a space? If you're trying to look on the internet, can you find playtesters in the same time zones as you? If you're looking for a context or a style of interest, are people going to have that? Maybe you can find people who love D&D, but finding someone who will play your bizarre indie thing about breakup processing is hard. Or maybe you mostly have bizarre indie friends and you really want to write a module for Pathfinder and none of them want to play that. I'm sure that's happened to people too. The world contains multitudes. So yeah, finding and cultivating your community, I feel like, is tricky because also meeting people is not automatically community. And any subgroup or club or fan community or creative space is going to have bad actors.
Yeah, definitely.
And there's also like stressful and weird and awful histories of that happening. Like there are pretty robust whisper networks about things sometimes. There are conventions I've never been to where I've then heard through the grapevine that someone was like habitually grooming people. So there's also those factors where if you're trying to do freedom, you have to interact with a lot of other people. If you interact with a lot of other people,
drama queens.
Yes, you have a whole range. You range from people who have pointless drama, to people who are actively dangerous. And if you are new and you don't know them, you don't have enough data to know the difference either. And that's also really scary. And it's also just time and energy, I've had big creative ebbs and flows, and a lot of it relates to my work. One of the reasons I'm able to be having this conversation right now is because I quit my job, and so I have a lot more energy and schedule flexibility than I did a few months ago.
So thank you so much, and thank you, Dave.
Yes. Yeah, and so that's another challenge too, where for a lot of us, this is a labor of love. Even the people I know who are doing tabletop games as their main job, I don't know anyone who's rich from it. And so it takes a lot of time and energy to pour into that. And so balancing that energy and not burning yourself out for the sake of your creative projects, I think, is another really big and ongoing challenge that a lot of us deal with on a lot of fronts. And that's looked different ways to me at different times. But I would say that the best antidotes I found for that are, honestly, therapy, doing various kinds of work to practice having good boundaries, notice your own needs in your body. And also, again, cultivating community is hard, but I think it's worth doing. My friends help me pay attention to how I'm treating myself and help me take good care of myself. And my friends also help me with my creative ideas and my projects. And I find it very, very fun to brainstorm with other people. And often if I'm in a creative lull, I might have a friend who has an idea and we can pick it up and work on it together. And by giving them a little bit of a momentum on their game idea, I get back some energy. I'm reminded by how much I love doing game design. And it brings some of the energy back to me. Or if my friends were like, hey, there's a really good COVID safety policy-based LARP convention in the Twin Cities. You should come to it and see all of us because we're local. And then I go and play deeply bizarre LARPs for a long weekend and come back bubbling with ideas. I have a friend, I'm doing an ongoing brainstorm. We want to write a LARP about the sort of the boom and the bust, the era where there were a whole bunch of like gay bars and clubs in the US that had very precarious existences where often they were being harassed by the police, harassed by landlords, dealing with weird and marginal fiscal space situations, but also being these really complicated and important sites of community that got hit hard by a whole bunch of different factors. And then the AIDS epidemic also hit. And we want to look a lot at the shape of community in those moments. So we're doing a combination of LARP design work and a whole bunch of historical research. We are both queer people, but neither of us were gay leathermen in the 1980s. So if we want to look at that specific cultural dimension, we need to be connecting with a lot of other people and a lot of other community resources. But that's happening because we were both at a LARP convention in the Twin Cities, and it reminded us of how many energies we share and how many things we wanted to work on creatively together. And in particular, one of the LARPs that we played in together there was something that made me think a lot about the nature of Edge-a-LARP. LARPs designed specifically to teach you something. There was a designer, that event named July, whose last name I'm blanking on, but I'm sure I could find this. This event was Make a Scene in Minneapolis, Minnesota. Make a Scene is an amazing yearly event. And one of the games that was run there this year was Desaparecidos, which is based in part on the game writer's father's experiences in Argentina in the 1970s when there was a fascist military coup. And a number of people were kidnapped by the government and taken to secret prisons and either just killed there and never released and records about them erased, or eventually released, but with severe trauma. And also there are people who were not taken to these sites, but who were left wondering what had happened to their loved ones, and some of them never got answers. And the game writer's father, his roommate was kidnapped by a military government, and he never saw him again. And so it's this game that is exploring through dance. It uses tango. It uses dance-based storytelling interactions, based on Argentinian dance culture and history of tango, to create this imagined space where tango is this ritual that allows you to talk to people across time and space. So there are these little fractional moments where you can, through dancing with each other in character, and there's a dance workshop at the start of the game, you are able to connect with your loved one, either on the inside in the secret prison or on the outside if you are one of the people imprisoned. And all of the characters that you could be in that LARP, all the little pre-written character concepts, are based on actual records of people. Usually a combination of 2 or more actual people who lived and in some cases were killed during that time. Though many of the characters are based on people who survived, because that's who we have records of, who can still share about their experiences. So I and one of my dear friends who I was involved in running a zine festival with online when we first met, we were playing members of the activist Homosexual Liberation Front, a gay men's activist movement that was happening in Argentina at the time. A couple where they've been split up, where they're a teacher and a lawyer, and the lawyer they are both taken to prison, and then the teacher is released after a week, and the lawyer is kept with no explanation. And so they're talking to each other across these strange supernatural distances. And that game was understandably incredibly intense, physically and emotionally, because we were dancing while enacting the process of mourning a loved one who might have been murdered by the government and you haven't found out yet.
That's really a unique game.
It's amazingly unique, and the debrief was so important because you can't play a game like that and just go, okay, bye. There was a walk down where the writer and facilitator sat down with us and talked to us about the process of writing the game, their connection to the source material, and had reflective activities for us to do. So out of that energy in that moment, but still remember what we learned. And so that left me with a really deep new energy to just be I want to see and engage with more LARPs that are teaching history and about distinctive events, because you can't perfectly recreate that experience, and you wouldn't want to. That people were being tortured by the military. We're not going to play a game where we're actually tortured by the military. And also we don't know everything that happened, because this is about a historical event where a bunch of records were erased. But through those gaps, you have these productive spaces where, with the information we have, if you do your research, if you're thoughtful, if you're thorough, if you think about what the experience is like from the people who lived through it, and if you think about what kind of experience it is physically and emotionally safe to have people reenact, I think you can really amazing learning and connectivity and help people understand and get passionate about things that they might not have thought about otherwise. And the author themselves directly said that for them, part of why they wrote the game was that their father has not really been capable of talking about what happens to him and how he lost his friends. That's a very hard thing to talk about. And they perfectly understand his experience. But through researching and writing and facilitating that game, they are creating a window where other people are helping them co-create this experience that is helping them sit with some of the things of their father.
That was really
It links back into what I felt when I was reading those indie comics from the 1980s that were written by people who were living through the rise of the AIDS epidemic, where there wasn't good medical information, where the government was openly mocking people.
Yeah.
with everything from derision to silence. And people were in the middle of this traumatic, complicated moment. They were making art.
That's the shared experiences that makes it unique. The game, of course, was definitely unique, but also that's like it was a part of life, and that way it resonates. Yeah, that really,
I think it's very valuable. Also, it's a thing to take very seriously because I think it'd also be possible to try to make a game about that and have it just be very dark in a way that is like not respectful of the experiences of what actually happened.
definitely got that.
It's a very complicated, tender thing to try to do. But I think it is the kind of thing that is worth trying to do, and I would like to see people explore more things like that because I think it could be incredibly powerful. I also realize that I am on some fronts a very weird tabletop gamer. I'm not alone in this because many people do write games like this, but I am very, very willing to play a game about intense tragedy. I do not necessarily play tabletop games to go be a little hero on an adventure. Sometimes I do, but I will also absolutely sit down to play a game where my character is going to have a terrible, terrible time. I like that. I find that fascinating and sometimes like emotionally valuable in weird ways.
Hmm. It's kind of like a therapy session in a way. You have the chance to empathy, and also, that's kind of like a old Greek tragedies. It gives
Yeah.
you the space to understand the deeper meaning behind it. I feel like that's
It
what
lets you
makes
sit feelings and process them without them having to be about you and your specific life. They can
definitely.
still be about another character or another thing. You can create a few degrees of remove. And I have had people say about some of my games, because to be fair, I don't think my games are therapy. I don't write them to try to be therapy. But I have had people tell me that some of my games make them think about things that their therapists have told them to do. Like one of my solo games, As Soft as You Remember, is a game about Selkie folklore. Selkie are like one of my folkloric creatures, like shapeshifters who wear a seal skin that they can take off. But if their seal skin is stolen from them, they're trapped in their human form. They can't go back into the ocean. And so there's a lot of really it very much feels like Selkies have existed as a way to talk about relationship trauma and abuse. Because a lot of classic folklore is about Selkie women coming to dance on the beach naked in the moonlight in human form, having thrown their sealskins on the shore, and then human men stealing their skins and trapping them, making them their wives. Myths about Selkie men are sometimes a little less common, but Selkie men myths are about them coming onto land, seducing human women, getting them pregnant, and then fleeing to the ocean. Very different experience than Selkie women. Sometimes they come back 7 years later to pick up their kid and get shot by their old lover's new human husband. That's another narrative beat. So lots of weird tragedies about gender and relationship choice. So I wrote a game, and I'm also not the only person to have written tabletop games about this. There's a really delightful number of complex tragedy games about Selkies and the process of trying to claim sealskin. But As Soft as You Remember, it's a solo reflective game that you play with a deck of cards. And if you want to play it precisely as written, you should have a piece of comfortable clothing and a salty piece of food with you. Because at the end of the game, you're going to put back on your comfortable clothing and taste salt to represent going back into your seal form and returning to the ocean. Because it's about the process. It's a Selkie story, but it's very clearly about the process of leaving a traumatic relationship situation. It's about you've got your seal skin back. You can't just jump back in the water away. That is too frightening. You need to process what happened. I think your audio glitched a little bit for me. If there's something,
Yeah. It looks like that. Yeah, I was saying that's a whole another experience in itself. Yeah,
exactly. And it was very intentionally. That's one of the games where people have gone, yeah, this, the experience of going, oh, you've been through something traumatic and complicated, and you're not going to heal instantly. You're going to need to sit with it. You're going to need to reflect. And and I don't think there's particularly any premise that when a Selkie goes back into the ocean that everything is now perfect and they will never again think of that really brutal experience they had. But they've got to a point where they're able to leave, because it is often very, very hard to leave traumatic and abusive situations for a host of reasons. And Selkie myths, I think, just make that very literal. They're like, there's a magic item and they locked it in a box, and you can't leave without your special magic item that's part of your soul. But there are so many other things in people's lives that can lock them into relationships and situations. Money, children, psychological control, and things. And so I think of the Selkie very much as a way to talk about the complicated trauma of gender and relationships and the lack of agency people often have to shape those decisions in their lives, or to leave even if they know something is dangerous for them.
So
Again, comes back to empathy. I think it's a great spot for exploring empathy for people in complex situations.
So you use the TTRPGs as a tool of social, let's say that awareness, and also, of course, personal and psychological awareness.
Yeah,
And also, you believe that some of your games also, in a way, helps people to understand them better, right?
I hope that at least some of the time, yeah, my games can be creative experiences that help people think about who they are and what they want in their lives, and what's meaningful to them. And I've also, I think, I know I'm not alone in that too. I've definitely played in other games where people talk about a really reflective personal experience they had from a game. My name, Moss, I didn't realize I was doing that, but I tried it out by making that the name of a character I played in a tabletop game. And I changed my name to Moss on the Discord server I was playing the game, and then we finished the game and I just didn't change it back.
Mm-hmm.
It felt nice. And then I sat with that and I went, huh, I need to think about this some more. And I've run into other people who've had that experience too. Where by letting yourself experience being different characters and exploring different worlds, it's often a really powerful way to self-reflect. I think it also helps people practice a lot of tools around safety and boundary setting and communication, because a lot of games have really official and specific rules about that. Ben Robbins' game Microscope has really interestingly clear rules about who is in charge of what when it is different people's turn.
Yeah.
That when it is your turn, your creative ideas are in the lead. Other people can ask you questions or make suggestions, and you don't have to take them, and you don't have to incorporate them into what you put down on the board. And then when it's the other person's turn, now they have full creative control. And I found that was another game that I referenced in one of my culminating essays for my graduate school work, because I found that was a beautifully clear format that you can translate very directly to working with kids, where you can go, hey, right now you are in charge of this specific task or process or creative thing, and we are going to defer to you. And then you will have to defer to other people. We are going to take turns being in charge of this thing. We are going to pass off wooden spoon for mixing this cookie dough we're making together. We are going to pass off this special art supply that we have to handle carefully. We are going to take turns sharing our idea for we're going to add to. Being really clear and explicit about that. It's awesome with kids, but plenty of adults need that too. We can, I think, all keep building our communication skills our whole lives. And I think doing tabletop gaming and then getting a master's of education degree, I really started noticing many of the ways that people make it to adulthood, and there's many communication tools we have not learned. As in an education graduate program, you learn a lot about concepts like wait time and the ways that people share space and facilitate learning in classrooms and other environments, and how easy it is to interrupt people and to overlook people, and for things to be balanced, or for your internal biases to shape who you're calling on or who you're interacting with. And so I think a lot of the rules and structures in tabletop games, if they are made thoughtfully and facilitated well, can help you really pay attention to how people communicate in different formats, and can help you practice different ways of communicating. And so they can also help you build tools for listening better, for being kinder, for sharing perspectives with other people, for being less scared to say no or to set boundaries. If you've often been in formats where people don't listen to you and don't respect your boundaries, if you have you're like, I'm tapping the X card. We all practiced at the start of the game. Everyone at this table agreed that if one of us taps this card, we're able to pause and remove something from the story that we're not comfortable having in it. I am practicing, and maybe this is a lot lower stakes than, asking my parents to stop saying really inappropriate stuff to me about whether or not I'll ever have kids, or, or ask a friend to stop making mean jokes at my expense. But here at this table in this space where people have made a shared goal to hold boundaries in this way, I can practice this tool. And I think that can be really, really valuable too. I think it's also why a lot of neurodivergent people really, really love tabletop games. It's really nice sometimes to be in a space where there are clear shared rules about communication that you've talked about together before you start using them.
Definitely, you can understand that.
Yeah.
So I also would like to go on to the next topic, actually,
Yeah.
that we have, since we're talking about the accessibility of the TTRPGs and gaming in general, and game design. So I would like to address your queer identity, and yes, and also your relation with the TTRPG community. So how do you feel about being a queer in this community? Was
I
it
feel like
okay?
for me, it's been a really good experience, but it's also important. Like, I am I am a white, queer, and trans person living in the U.S., like Pacific Northwest.
Of course, of course.
Oh, I am a very common and like culturally familiar version of queerness and transness for a lot of people, like in this region. Um, I was also very lucky, like my family has always been very supportive of me. So I got raised with good support resources where I definitely faced a lot of harassment in school, and from peers. And that did make figuring out some things about myself a lot harder. But I knew I had a base of like safety and support that I could count on. And that makes a really, really big difference. And also for me, my entry point into learning about tabletop games was through a lot of games by LGBTQ creators and games that were exploring those themes. Like Avery Alder was one of the first designers whose work I got really into, openly trans and queer game designer. Writing games that are often very explicit about that. Monster Hearts, that specifically it gets talked about. Hey, this is a game about like concepts of the monstrous and the supernatural and how those interact with the messy experiences of being a teenager and going through puberty and figuring out things about like your gender and your sexuality and your identity and like how you want to be in the world. Like those are all very directly talked about in the nature of the game, and people are encouraged to engage with that. And it also is engaging with some of the hardships. The fact that if you are a young queer person, you may be made to feel like a monster. You may feel like something in your body is out of your control, is changing in a way that you don't like or that doesn't feel safe for you, that other people are treating you as a danger. Like those are very real and visceral experiences that are often being explored through games. Because again, if you put something at a couple degrees of remove, sometimes it's a little easier to look at it and talk about it because you don't have to talk deeply about everything about yourself or your specific experience in order to look at the theme and the idea. So I would say for me, being queer in the tabletop game community has really been a lot of reminder of the fact that there is not a singular community. There's not even a singular community like among queer people in Seattle. There's all kinds of little facets and groups and people who know each other and people who don't know each other and the people who volunteer at this convention, the people who volunteer at that convention, and the people who go to this tabletop game meetup, and the people who are in this online server, and the people who are focused on Dungeons and Dragons, and the people who are focused on the indie scene, and the people who are focused on OSR and hate both of them sometimes or love both of them depending. So I feel like a lot of what it has been for me is that I have been lucky, but I have seen enough of what else is out there that I feel very actively lucky. If I had met some different people, I could have been pulled down much more self-hating channels or been in spaces where if I might have been led to feel like if I wanted to do this hobby, that I would have to hide some parts of myself. But I was lucky that is not where I landed. I landed another openly queer and trans person who invited me to go to a tabletop game event in Capitol Hill, which is one of the most classically like LGBTQ focused neighborhoods in Seattle. So the groundwork there was very strongly and positively laid. And so I was able to meet and build community with people who were very open to talking about that and where that was already a lot of facets of people's design work. I think one of the things I would say about that too is just that like I found a lovely little bubble that works well for me. There is always room for more. When I talk about tabletop games with people who are not already in the game design scene, the most common response is, oh, like Dungeons and Dragons. A lot of people don't know what a tabletop game is, or if they do know what it is, they think I mean board games, or they think I mean Dungeons and Dragons. And I've played Dungeons and Dragons. It's not the worst game in the world, but I don't like its weird, large-scale corporate visibility compared to other game systems. I think it's not helpful for teaching people about the range of what's possible. And I think it also very much, without even having to try at this point, just because of the amount of cultural narratives that exist around it already, ends up teaching a lot of people that the way you play a tabletop game is you're all individual, strong heroes, and you go around hacking things apart with swords and or magic. And if you have fun doing that, that's totally fine. I have absolutely played games like that, but I very much want that to not be the only thing that people think tabletop games are for. And I think that queer creators in particular have a lot of really amazing and creative energy that we can bring to the tabletop design space in terms of what it looks like to tell a story and who get to be the heroes in stories. And also what does it look like to tell stories where there's no inherent hero, where the world is messy, where it's complicated, where maybe we're telling stories about awkward groups of friends or entire planets, or like the moss on the floor of a forest over the course of 1,000 years. Like these are all things I've actually seen happen in games. I think there's room for more range and creativity, and that the less you are locked into a specific narrative about who is the hero, who is the leader, what is the classic, like the classic normal style of story to tell in a game, the more room there is to create creative work that's exciting and interesting for everyone. And so if you think you want to play tabletop games and you tried one or two, or you went to an event and you went, wow, I feel really not okay here socially. You're not required to like tabletop games, to be clear, but I love them. I'm very positively biased. And I can guarantee you that whatever your experience was, if you went to one or two tabletop events, you have not experienced everything that tabletop can be. There are other groups with other themes and energies out there, and you can build the spaces you want. I have volunteered at events. I have run games that would not have gotten run otherwise unless I stepped up and offered them. There are lots of spaces where if there's a thing you're excited about or an energy you want to share, you can find a space to get it moving.
I definitely agree. Definitely agree, because the events and the cons are pretty crucial in our hobby, since we have so few people and we have to interact with each other and connect as much as we can. That's definitely
Exactly.
important. So I also want to ask you another question about that whole society thing, and also the gender thing, because I know that you were also working on sex ed projects. So I just want you to just define the project a bit and tell us something about it.
Yeah, so I have been this has been collaborative projects that I've done. So there is an event that happens roughly yearly. It's been going for a few years, called Clinical Hits. Um yeah, and it is a collaboration between LARP designers and sexual health educators. And so it gets all, I also love it. It's run in a very interestingly COVID safe way, where there is an in-person portion and then there is also a virtual portion, and you get to connect with both groups of people. But for your design work, you'll generally be paired up with people who are either also online or also at the in-person event venue. Um, and it does some great groundwork where if you are mainly a game designer, you will get to do an introductory workshop to teach you about best practices in teaching sexual health. And if you are mainly a sex educator, you can go to a workshop that will teach you a little bit about game design, so that people start with some shared language. And then there's this great kind of open brainstorming session where people talk about ideas they have. What are topics or concepts where they think it would be really great to like try to use educational LARP to teach about something. A
Mhm.
lot of things end up engaging with relationship communication, like healthy communication styles, because that, as I was saying, is a thing that I think is really great to practice through role play. Because it makes it safer to practice these things when it's not actually about you and the intimacy you want to have with another person in particular, or how to say no to that, or how to learn about something that's scary or awkward. It's about these imaginary people. It's about these slightly more abstract situations, but you can still practice the tools that make using it in your regular life more emotionally available. So there's been several years running of Clinical Hits, and I have worked together on a couple of projects for that. One of which was called, we had fun with the name, it's called Flight Deck Med Check. And we wrote it as being kind of about medical self-advocacy, how to talk about like yourself and your needs and your body with healthcare providers. But it was run through the format of like, you are potentially someone who's applying to go on like a space travel related project. And so there's all these medical things you have to go through to potentially qualify for that you might not be used to interacting with in your regular life. So all the characters are automatically thrown into a little bit of like an unfamiliar or potentially stressful situation in terms of having to interact with medical authority. And it helps you have to practice like communicating about your needs, about your boundaries, about those different dimensions of your work. And I need to go double check what the name was of one of, my other project that I did was Alien Diplomats. And that was another one where we went really silly with it. It was very much about communication, where you're aliens from a bunch of different planets and you're traveling to an important intergalactic conference on a little ship. But your translators break down. And so there's a period of time where you cannot communicate directly with words. You have to figure out how to get emotionally aligned with each other without having all the same communication tools you usually would have in order to fix your translators. And so I really love Clinical Hits because I feel like it's just this great idea generator that helps game designers think more about the educational applications of their work, and helps sex educators think more about creative ways to do educational practice that might make it more accessible, especially because topics like sexual health education can be really scary. They can be filled with a lot of shame. A lot of people have already gotten a lot of misinformation in their lives about it, and people are starting from all kinds of different places. You know, some people have a lot of knowledge. Some people make it fully to adulthood and know almost nothing because they were never given the opportunity to learn, or the topic was made to be very scary or unapproachable for them, or they were told things that were just lies, or some combination thereof. So I feel like it's a format where empowering people on multiple fronts to get excited about the different ways that sexual health education can look is a really powerful endeavor. And John Cole is one of the ongoing organizers of that. And he's the person that we both played Desaparecides together and went, we want to write more historical LARP that teaches people about complex histories. And now we're like researching the gay leather bar scene of the 1980s. So that's how that project started to come together. But yeah, I fully hope to do more projects like Critical Hits in future. If they run it again, I will, every time I've had the chance to be in that group, I will do it. And I think it would be great if more projects like that get run, because again, like there's so many different community needs you could engage with that too. You can totally do an event like that with health educators specific to a region or a community and try to really dig in and go, hey, we're going to pull in game designers from other places. You're going to really check in with people who are based in this community who can talk to you about their educational needs and work together to help build new kinds of teaching tools. I feel like that resource sharing can be really exciting and valuable. The other reason that I love that work is because I'm a game designer, as I've noted. I also used to work in sexual health education. I was a peer sexual health educator when I was a teenager. I wrote educational songs about how to use condoms. I did all kinds of stuff like that. Yeah. And then when I was in college, I worked at the health education center for my college. So I've experienced multiple facets of the elements of Critical Hits. I've been a sexual health educator. I've been a game designer. It's really exciting to get be part of an event where I'm getting to really bring all of myself in a really strange and specific way and make use of a bunch of different skills at once. The other thing that I think is really important and valuable about the work that Critical Hits does in the nature of EduLARP in general, I brought up a little bit before, but that's the power of debrief. If you play a game that encourages you to engage with something really intense or interesting or that you can learn a lot about, and then they go, okay, bye, that's not going to stick with you. Or something might stick with you, but it might stick with you in a really weird way. That's not really going to help you learn from it. And a lot of what gets talked about in EduLARP, if a LARP is going to be an EduLARP, if it's going to intentionally be an educational project, it has to have a debrief. They are very clear and explicit about that. You need to lock in that learning. You need to support people emotionally and conceptually in understanding and reflecting on what they did in the game. And I think that's really valuable for games that are intentionally teaching tools. And I also think it's really nice for a lot of games in general, because it helps you remember and reflect on what you liked or didn't like about a game, consider what you might want to play in future, what other things you might want to try, and also get a chance to like appreciate each other for creating a really cool creative space together. Or if something was tough and maybe, you had to use the X card or like some other boundary setting tools that are sometimes stressful or scary for people to use.
Yeah.
If you're having to practice those communication skills, if debrief is automatically built into your gameplay and is facilitated well, that helps people make that experience more accessible, where maybe then you can play stranger, more emotionally intense or interesting games, or mechanically new to you games. And even if this is a little weird or awkward or funky for me at some points, I get chances to reflect and decide how I felt about that, what I want to leave behind, what I want to take away, like what I've learned from this game experience.
So do you have any for example, when you create a TTRPG or any kind of LARP or something, do you have any kind of a secret sauce or something that you use, secret recipe?
Honestly, it's hard to come down to a single secret thing. I've given you a lot of the secrets already, which is just Carolyn Hobbs' downfall is so good that it changed how I think about games. That's one. Point two, I love random generator, like random tables. There are a lot of resources for that built online, both like physically and digitally. Lots of books, especially like in the OSR, like the old school revival, like School of Gaming. There's lots of big weird tables of all the things you might run into in this dungeon hallway. If I'm really stuck on a concept, I will sometimes go see if there's an existing random table thing online or a game I have that has a thematically relevant random table, and I will roll on it until something activates. Like, what kind of weird creature do I want the players to meet? Oh, it's going to be a giant frog. Oh, that gave me an idea. Hold on. Sometimes that's enough. The other big secret sauce is brainstorm with your friends, even if they're not necessarily game designers. If you're working on your very weirdly specific thing, a big thing when I was writing This Party Sucks, this kind of connects to the other thing. Listen to music. Make something be the creative or thematic anchor. I wrote This Party Sucks for a game jam that encouraged people to write games based on music, either specific songs or albums, or like a discography of an artist. So if you're feeling really stuck and you're like, I need to do something creative, I need to figure something out, find either a favorite song or a really weird song that like entices you in some way, play it on repeat a few times and just doodle or take notes and see what themes come out of that, because that is how I wrote one of my favorite things I ever wrote. And that was a very popular game jam that got run several times. People wrote a lot of really wild stuff out of that. Like, go to other creative work. Go play a different game. If you're really stuck, go play a different game. It doesn't have to be anything like the thing you want to write. Maybe it's better if it's not, because then you won't be trying to replicate it. But it will shake some things loose for you. You need to let yourself be creative on multiple fronts. Because I think a lot of us, we get stuck and we try to push ourselves. Like, I just need to get it. I just need to work more on this. I just need to make it work. No. Take a break, have a snack, read a weird book, play a weird game, talk to your lovely weird friends, roll on a random table, rattle things around a little bit. That is usually what helps me get new energy on a thing. And when in doubt, I say get weirder. If you want to make something mellow again later, you can. But let yourself go to the really absurd idea. Don't be scared of it. You can always do things in editing. But let yourself have the weird little ideas. And again, and steal widely. Give credit. But yeah, grab that game. Like, grab that mechanic that you love and play around with it, and you will find ways to make it your own. I think those are all things that have really helped boost me in different ways, especially just brainstorming with friends. A lot of elements in This Party Sucks in particular are just based on people I know's actual experiences of awkward queer relationships in their 20s. When I made lists of like things that can be uncomfortable at a house party, or awkward connections you can have to someone, or like nervous habits you might have. Those are just pulled from actual people I talked to, or things that came up in the music I was listening to, or a little virtual survey I made. I made a little Google survey. People fill out if they wanted to send me ideas for character thematic generation for This Party Sucks. So just some random LGBTQ people on the internet sent me like their favorite items of clothing and hobbies and nervous habits and names, and I put those in the game. So yeah, just pick other people's brains, and that will help enliven you too. You don't need to create alone. I'm not saying you can't. If you are able to sit down in your room and write the game from start to finish, and you're happy with what you made, yay. But talk to people, play test with other people, read and engage with media made by other people. Remember that you are connected, and that will help bring you different energy and new ideas.
And my last question is actually, do you have anything to add?
Oh, well, I think even from the short time we've known each other, you know that I could talk almost endlessly. So there's a lot of things I could add, but I think if I'm going to emphasize just one thing, I would say, if you are curious and excited about tabletop games and game design and you are not sure where to start, I encourage you to go on itch.io or any platform. Itch.io is a good place to browse and look at game jams, because that's a lot of how I got going. Itch.io has a bunch of them, and there's a bunch of other ones that get run yearly. The 200-word RPG is running again on Tumblr right now. The Golden Cobra LARP Awards just came out. There'll be another Golden Cobra round next year. Go read little games people have written for game jams, because I think that will be a really lovely and powerful reminder that you can really start wherever you want to. And maybe you'll look back on your early games and go, oh, wow, I didn't know what I was doing. I know I feel that way about some of mine. But if you've created something, then that is already a win. That is creating that energy in the world that will let you share things. And I guess, specifically to do a little boost to some things I've been involved with, if you go look through my itch.io page, one of that you will find there is my extremely tiny game, You Are a Magic Sword. And if you go through that, you'll be able to find that it was a submission to Business Card Jam. I hosted that. We encourage people to make games so tiny that they could fit on business cards. That was a great envelope with what that looked like. And that was a very pre-pandemic idea, and that we were especially thinking about how people exchange business cards at conventions, and how often then those just get lost in the bottom of your bag or backpack and you never look at them again, or they all go in the recycling. And we were trying to think about ways to make having a business card a more engaging thing that actually reflects the nature of being a tabletop game designer. But at Business Card Jam, there are 84 games there that are all different weird tiny games that fit on this much paper. You can write it. I believe in you. That is the thing I want to. I believe you can write a game.
That was really lovely and nice. Thank you so much. Really, it was a great talk to you.
You have a lovely cozy tavern, and it makes me so happy to get to talk about the nature of game design and game community and queerness and education and all these different things that are so enmeshed in different parts of my life that I bring into the tabletop game space. And thank you so much for creating space to highlight the different things that people are bringing into their game work. Because we all have so much to add. Our experiences are what make this a whole bunch of different lively and interesting communities.
It was really valuable. It is really valuable to me, to people to express, of course, their own selves and also their unique creations. Because in this hobby, we need more.